Las Vegas last week. Who feels as tired as I do? I feel absolutely hammered, even now. Hammered through tiredness, by the way, not through anything else. Okay, so that's the third time that I've done this talk. The third time that I've done a Reinvent recap at this meetup, not the third time I should have done this talk. It's actually the first time I've done this talk, so if there are continuity gaps, that'll be why. So, as you mostly know, my name's Ian. I lead evangelism for AWS in EMEA. And I also work on the Reinvent team together with the rest of the evangelists at AWS. Danilo and I, who's in the front, is going to be speaking tonight. We're very fortunate. We were one of a handful of AWS team members that were allowed into the keynote at this year's AWS Reinvent. And the reason for that is we help out with the social media coverage of the event. That's actually part of our job. But we actually had so many customers in Las Vegas this year that we had to split the keynote up. We had 10,000 in a room that were able to see it in person, and then several overflows to accommodate the other 22,000 people that were at the event this year. So it was a real big logistical challenge. What I'm going to do in this first talk is just try and give you a flavor of some of the stuff that we announced, recap a few things, and I'm going to give away a couple of things as well at the end. Okay, sound good? We don't have much time, okay, so I'm going to go quite quickly. If you have questions, I will be around for the rest of the evening. Danilo will be around. Julian will be around from the team when he gets in off the Eurostar, and we can answer questions offline maybe. So the first thing is, 2016 is another record year for AWS in terms of innovation. We think that we will hit 1,000 new services and features released this year if we ship around 70% of what we have planned for December. Okay, so we're at the 900 and something mark at the moment. The Reinvent keynotes were the biggest series of launches that we've ever done. Over the course of 2 days, we launched around 25 new services. Okay, last year we launched about 13, so it's a big uptick from what we did last year. And we continuing to try and push that number up even further next year. So working on a lot more interesting stuff that we're going to announce in the future. Quickly summarizing some of the announcements from the day one keynote. So we started Reinvent with this selection of compute, these families of instances. And we announced quite a few enhancements. The first thing that we enhanced was new larger T2s. So these are the burstable capacity instance type that are intended for workloads that have variable CPU performance requirements, with this idea of accumulating unused CPU budget capacity in a bucket that you can then draw down. We introduced 2 new larger ones with 16 gigs and 32 gigs of RAM, which are intended for memory-intensive workloads that have variable compute requirements. That was the first new announcement. Then we went on to announce some revisions. These are quite interesting. So the R4, it's the next generation high memory instance, so an instance type that has proportionally more memory than the CPU. Very cost-effective way to acquire RAM for your applications. This is available immediately in the majority of regions around the world, so you can use this straight away. And this is quite a good example, actually, of where there's a good financial benefit from modernizing your infrastructure. If you were running on an R3 and you swapped that R3 for an R4 on Wednesday afternoon last week, you'd take about 10% off your bill for your R3 capacitor just by stopping and starting your instances. If you are using memory-intensive family, you should definitely do that. There are other benefits, a small CPU performance bump. Also, we increased the size of the largest instances, so double the amount of memory in the big one, double the amount of vCPUs in the large one, and also we got double-speed DDR4 RAM in this new instance family as well. So if you have any memory-intensive R3s that you're using, you should switch them for this immediately. Then we pre-announced a couple more instance revisions that are going to be coming soon. The i3, which is the new I/O-intensive family, which will replace the i2. Most interesting thing about this is we're moving away from SSDs to these NVMe slot cards that go in the PCIe slots on the machines. If you have a high-performance gaming rig at home, you might use those already. You can use them in servers as well, and that's what we're going to be doing with this new instance family. 9 times the I/O performance of the previous generation. That's because we're putting the storage that much closer to the CPU on the PCIe bus. And again, we doubled the maximum size of that instance type as well. Then we also pre-announced the C5s, also coming soon. Again, twice as big in the largest instance type. We're moving to the Haswell V4 Skylake processors. And we also increased the amount of throughput on the EBS volumes for these particular instances as well. So it's uprating everywhere. I'm not going to cover the James Hamilton talk that also took place at Reinvent on the Tuesday night, late at night. But in that talk, James was talking about some of the stuff that we've been doing to improve the platform. And one of the things that he talked about was our move to introduce our own custom-built 25 gigabit Ethernet fabric in our regions around the world. And you'll notice that this number is kind of in some way slightly related to 25 gigs. So you can probably guess that these instances are now starting to take advantage of that new fabric. That's why we can offer enhanced performance for the much larger instances that we have as well. So we filled out the family with some new revisions, lowering costs and also offering larger capacity consumption units with improved performance as well. The next thing we announced was also related to compute. This is actually something that watchers of the Zen hypervisor, the open source project for the Zen hypervisor, might have seen a while ago. There was a driver contributed to the Zen hypervisor that allowed elastic attach and detach of GPU capacity. And what we've done here is enable customers to elastically add and remove GPU capacity from EC2 instances on a flexible basis. So if you need a fraction of a GPU for some floating point intensive workload that you have, you're going to be able to attach that to your instance as though it was an EBS volume. So it will appear as a device that you can read and write to from your software, and you'll be able to access fractional GPUs billed on the basis of their consumption. So it'd be a good fit for rendering workloads and other floating point intensive workloads as well. That's brand new. Then we started talking about the other end of the spectrum. So the stuff that I've talked about there, those larger instance families, those GPUs, obviously mostly targeted on relatively sophisticated users that have quite substantial workloads running in the cloud. Of course, there's the other end of the spectrum, very simple consumption of things like VPS services, which we haven't really had an offering for before. A lot of people run those kind of services on the T2, on the small T2s, but it's probably a little bit complex to do so. We wanted to try and simplify down the developer experience for customers that have very simple requirements. And for this, we announced a brand new service called Amazon Lightsail. And this is a sort of VPS-style service, very simple, very easy to consume. Actually has a separate website, amazonlightsail.com, that you can access it via. And you have this very simple three-step process, basically choosing the operating system and other software that you want to run on the machine. And there are common open source software frameworks available here, things like WordPress and Drupal and others available from this drop-down menu. You select how big the machine is that you want. And when you select a machine size, we also pre-allocate a certain amount of included bandwidth or data transfer for you as well. Okay, so you're picking a bundle essentially at these different price points from $5 to $80. Choose a name, click go, and then we go through this process. We basically completely provision that resource for you, putting it into a hidden VPC inside your account so you can later on integrate it with other AWS services, but really trying to focus on making the experience as simple as it can be for customers that don't want the complexity of doing things like setting up a VPC, setting up security groups, making some of the decisions about how they're going to configure their EC2 instances. It's trying to simplify down that process. The other new thing that we announced from a compute perspective was this, the F1. If anybody, probably there's some people here that don't know what an FPGA is. It's a field programmable gate array. So you can take your code, you can compile your code into a build that will run on an FPGA, and in doing so, the deployment of the code reconfigures the FPGA to accelerate your algorithm or your process in silicon. So it's a very, very high performance mechanism for running things like video and audio transcoding, for running layout algorithms that you might use in engineering. Say you want to lay out a semiconductor and you've got 2 million transistors that you need to put on it. You'll have an algorithm that determines the optimal layout for those transistors. Well, you could push that into an FPGA and turn over the design cycle for those semiconductor products much, much more quickly by doing this. So we got these F1s that have these FPGAs available within them. You're going to use appropriate tooling to build these. And we'll have something new called an AFI, an Amazon FPGA image, a little bit like an army, but for FPGAs. And you'll be able to then deploy those armies, those AFIs, I guess they're called, directly onto this new instance type. And we think that over time, a marketplace of different FPGA-compatible applications will emerge for things like video transcoding, engineering simulations, product design, and the like. Okay, so that's brand new. This is a private preview at the moment. If you do have a need to use this, I'd recommend talking to one of our team. We want to gather more feedback from customers that are interested in using this particular service. So if that is something you want to take advantage of, let me or another member of the team know, and we'll connect you with our engineering and HPC team who can talk to you about it in more detail. So we love ourselves some compute services. We also love other stuff as well. So next we moved on to talking about analytics, introducing a new service for making it easier for customers who need to periodically run large analytics jobs to do so without having to run clusters. So the traditional way you would do that, of course, is Amazon Elastic MapReduce for Hadoop and Spark, or Redshift, our data warehousing service. And both of those things require you to create a corresponding cluster that sits inside of VPC. And that cluster has an hourly run cost, okay, with a minimum billing period of 1 hour. So even if you've got a small analytics job that you want to run infrequently, previously you would have had to build a cluster for that. There's quite a lot of complexity and overhead with that. So we wanted to simplify that by introducing ad hoc queries within S3. And for this, we announced a service called Amazon Athena. This allows you to load your data into S3 and then query it directly through an SQL-based interface without actually having to spin up a cluster. So some part of the S3 infrastructure provides the query capability for you natively on the data immediately after you've loaded it. Okay, and there were no fixed costs for running the cluster over an hour or any other period. Instead, you pay on the amount of data that you are scanning in order to execute your query. Okay, and there's a simple pricing model for that. So an obvious example here would be something like providing SQL query capabilities on top of web logs or on top of S3 logs or on top of CloudFront logs that you might accumulate, building reporting and dashboards directly from those data sets within S3 without having to spin up EMR or load that data into Redshift for query. Okay? And then we announced all this stuff. So an entirely new service family called Amazon AI, which Danilo's going to talk about in a lot more detail, but a tool for image recognition called Amazon Recognition that allows you to submit images and have the machine learning infrastructure suggest the contents of those images to you together with probability weightings. Okay, I won't steal any more of Danilo's stuff on that because he has a cool demo on it. Then we have Poli, submit text or SSML, which is speech synthesis markup language, and we will create you an audio file, an MP3 or another audio format file that reflects the spoken version of what you've just submitted. We support 45 different voices and 27 different languages, from Norwegian to Danish to English to Russian to French, all kinds of stuff, okay? And it's very, very, very easy to use. You just give it your text or SSML content, and it returns back to you either an audio stream or an audio file, a compressed audio file with the appropriate encoding that contains your speech. It does clever things like this as well. So you can give it that. The temperature in WA is 75 degrees F, and it knows that the way to speak that is to say the temperature in Washington is 75 degrees Fahrenheit. I actually went to a deep dive on this tool, which is obviously on YouTube. Very, very interesting the way that it works. Very, very interesting how nuanced the model is, precisely how complex input is dealt with and how it can represent that very realistically in speech. So if you want to build speech-enabled applications, that's obviously an important part of doing that. And then lastly, something called Amazon Lex, which is the engine within inside Alexa. So this enables you to build conversational applications with natural language flow. So what is the weather forecast? Weather forecast is it will be sunny and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. There's a much better demo actually, which was shown by another member of our team, which was, I'd like to book a flight to London on Sunday. What time would you like to fly? I'd like to fly at 5 p.m. What is your budget? $750. I can find 2 flights at $750 on Sunday at 5 p.m. Would you like to book one? So it'll automatically allow you to fill in the missing pieces of data in that conversational UI interface. You don't have to program the system to ask those questions. The deep learning will work out what pieces of information are missing from the conversation based on what pieces of information are required, and it will naturally prompt you to supply them. So it's a very simple way to build these conversational interfaces. And this allows you to embed speech in all sorts of devices, from vehicles to home automation equipment to medical equipment to imaging devices. Whatever you want, you can build a voice UI interface for it now. Then we started talking about enhancements to databases, just giving a few stats on the database migration service. And we announced the extension of the Aurora engine for RDS to include support for Postgres. So this is a new additional engine that we're going to add to Aurora. It has familiar characteristics of very high durability. So each time we write a transaction in Aurora, we commit it to 6 different storage locations in 3 different availability zones. So your data's very durable. And the decoupled access and storage architecture that we provide gives very, very rapid failover. So if you have multiple access nodes for your data, a master and then several read replicas, we can very quickly promote a read replica to a new master in the event that you lose that read-write data access node. So it's also very good for availability critical scenarios where you want to have minimal failover time in the event of certain failure scenarios occurring. So extending that to support Postgres. And then we had a little bit on IoT. So actually what Andy Jesse said here was, move to the cloud is kind of changing the way in which customers think about data centers. Many, many less servers out at the edge, but of course there's a lot of other stuff going out there now instead of servers. So a lot more intelligent devices, a lot more sensors. And one of the pieces of feedback that we've heard from customers here is it can be quite difficult to deploy these kinds of applications in some environments if you are absolutely dependent upon connectivity to the cloud. Actually had a conversation with one of the guys that worked on this service after the launch, and he told me that one of the use cases they were targeting here was mining, where they might want to have equipment which is controlled via IoT infrastructure, but is actually underneath the surface of the ground in dangerous environments where you can't use radio networks, and it's very, very difficult to build reliable fixed connectivity. And we released a software component called AWS Greengrass, which is an installable piece of software that you would put into an environment like that, and it would provide local area services for IoT devices that were off the network. So the ability to have local compute, secure communications, data caching, and messaging between devices that are not connected to the internet, so they can operate autonomously and independently of the AWS cloud. And you can do things like deploy Lambda functions onto these devices. They can deal with message routing using the AWS IoT rules engine, which I think is something that I've spoken about here previously. So that's the capability to manage pub/sub data flows between different devices, either routing them, or previously routing them via the MQTT gateways that AWS provides. But in the case of the Greengrass implementation, that logic will be deployed locally in what we call a Greengrass group as a Greengrass core device. And then those devices can have message flows between them and also logic embedded at the local level, at the edge of the network, without actually having to transit all that data back to one of our regions somewhere in the world. So it's a new capability for IoT developers that want to build autonomous or semi-autonomous IoT applications that use AWS but aren't completely dependent upon it. Okay, and then we announced just 2 more things. The next thing we announced was this. So this is the Amazon Snowball. Some of you might know this as a luggable. It was a 60 terabyte transportable storage unit that you could bring to your network, connect to your network with 10 gigabit Ethernet, and then copy data onto, and then dispatch it back to AWS, and we would load that data onto S3 in one of our regions so that you can process it. We announced quite a few enhancements to this, actually. We announced a capacity increase to 100 terabytes. We announced new clustering capabilities, so you can have multiple snowballs active concurrently in one location. We also announced a rack-mountable form factor as well, so you can put them all into a rack in your data center. You can fill them, and as they get full, you can take away the full ones and replace them with empty ones. And then as the next one gets full, you can take it out and send it back and replace it with an empty one. So it's intended to make continuous operation of Snowball on your premises simpler. We announced an S3 endpoint as well, so you can talk to Snowball using the S3 API rather than having to use other protocols. And we announced embedding of Amazon Greengrass inside the Snowball, enabling you to run Lambda functions locally on your premises with equivalent to an M4 4XL embedded within the device in terms of compute capacity as well. So AWS is in the server business now. We also announced 25 gigabit and 40 gigabit SPF Ethernet connectivity as well for these devices. So if you do have a lot of data to move, you can take advantage of higher bandwidth rates to connect into the devices as well, which I think is a pretty nice feature also. So that was one end of the spectrum. And then the other thing we announced was this. Pretty funny. This is the best tweet of the week from AWS. So we got 1,090 retweets and 1,200 likes on this. Introducing AWS Snowmobile exabyte scale data transport. Yes, that is a truck. Yeah. And at this point, we drove a 45-foot shipping container into the keynote in front of all these people. Danilo and I were sitting near the front, and all I could hear was these screams as a load of people ran past me with their phones to kind of capture this moment. It was quite funny. It's pretty funny. And then later on in the week, we moved it out into the expo so customers could take a look at how it was built. But that container has in it 100 petabytes of capacity. Okay? And the intent here is you would request this. It would drive to your data center. You would plug it into your high bandwidth network. You would move your data into it, and then we drive it back to AWS. So it's like high latency but incredibly high bandwidth data transfer device. Yeah. And optionally, you can have armed guards with it as well. That's not a joke. You can actually have like armed protection for the unit. But we do also encrypt all the data that you put on it with AES 256-bit keys, and we store those keys off the device. So it's a very secure way to move large volumes of data to the cloud. And you can do stuff like this. You can move an exabyte of data to AWS with 6 trips, and it will take you 6 months to do that. Pushing that over 10 gig Ethernet would take you 26 years. Okay. So that was. Say again? All for price and application. Yeah. Yeah. So this is individually priced on the basis of where it's going to go, you know, what delivery options you want and the rest of it. But there are customers that are very interested in using this kind of service in North America. Okay, there's a little interlude before I go on to part 2. Should we give away some items? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I have here an Amazon Echo Dot, which is the show edition with the Capital One band. So our sponsors, Capital One, actually gave every attendee at AWS Reinvent one of these. So a big commitment. And they also wrote an AWS Reinvent skill. So you could ask a skill developed by Capital One, things like, which party should I go to tonight? Let me tell you. And I have this as well. This is a very limited edition, large size only. This actually is a jacket that we gave out to our customer advisory board members. So I had to do a few favors for someone to get this jacket for you. It features a black on black Amazon Web Services logo on the sleeve. Anybody that's read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy will get that reference. The rest of you may not. Okay. So how am I going to do this? I have a trick for this. I might have to unplug my, I'll see. Give me a random number between 1 and 16.
4. 2. 9.
It's going out over there. 1 second, let's try that again. Give me a random number between 1 and 16. Give me a random number between 1 and 16. It's not working.
Your random number between 1 and 16 is 8.
8.
Go to row 8.
Row 8.
This is 1, and that is 2. Give me a random number between 1 and 2.
Your random number between 1 and 2 is 2.
How many seats are there in that row? Give me a random number between 1 and 7.
Your random number between 1 and 7 is 2.
Number 2. Position 2. Now, unfortunately, we don't have the capability to match size to seat numbers yet. So if you get this and it's the wrong size, I'm going to apologize now. Give me a random number between 1 and 16.
Your random number between 1 and 16 is 15.
Ooh. Give me a random number between 1 and 2.
Your between 1 and 2 is 1.
How many seats? How many seats do we have on this side? Give me a random number between 1 and 6.
Your random number between 1 and 6 is 1.
I'm sure it's got a high resale value on eBay.
Go again. Thank you so much.
Okay, so what I talked about so far was all in the day one keynote. And then we got on to Werner. Obviously, Werner has a unique presentation style. And he did actually announce the party artist at the end of his keynote as well. But I'm not going to talk about Martin Garrix. Okay, I can barely remember anything that happened that night. I was so tired. Right, so what are the best practices of transformational development? The first thing that Werner talked about was not really a service as much as a framework that we announced. And it's quite interesting for two reasons. It's interesting, firstly, because the guy that leads development of the well-architected framework at AWS is based here in the UK and has spent a long time actually working with customers locally to develop good practice for architecture for applications and services that are deployed on the AWS cloud. It's a guy called Philip Fitzsimons. And if you do ask us to do one of our well-architected framework audits with you, where we come on site and walk through your architecture and make sure that you are working in a way which is in line with our recommended best practices, there's a good chance that the Fitz will come along and observe that. What we announced were a couple of things. Firstly, that we added a fifth pillar to the framework, which is around operational excellence. So another set of guidelines that we're providing to customers to help them operate applications in the cloud in the best possible way. So if you are doing anything with AWS which is complex or mission critical or upon which your business relies, really recommend taking a look at this. The second thing we announced was a course, so a training deliverable for customers and partners that are interested in making use of the framework as well. So once again, I'd recommend you take a look at that if you're using AWS in production. Werner then went on to reference a few service enhancements and new service features that are aligned to some of the themes that are present within the framework. So talking about preparation, first of all, he just quickly recap progress on CloudFormation, but then he went on to announce a few new things. Firstly, that we have a new service called AWS OpsWorks for Chef Automate. This provides a fully managed Chef server that runs within AWS that enables you to offload some of the heavy lifting associated with using Chef to AWS. So that was the first thing. Then a new service called the Amazon EC2 Systems Manager, which is a set of management tools to help customers manage EC2 instances within their operational lifetime. So moving away from the immutable model, some applications don't necessarily support that too well, particularly legacy enterprise apps. EC2 Systems Manager is intended to enable you to manage the life cycle of the compute environments that you're running on AWS more effectively. And it can also reach back into infrastructure that you might be running elsewhere, either on your premises or in other co-location providers, and provide a coherent and holistic framework within which you can manage that as well. So reaching out from AWS to provide a consistent mechanism for managing the life cycle of operating system resources elsewhere as well. Then we announced something called Code Build. This is the missing piece, or previously missing piece, of what we call the Code Star series of services. So Code Commit, Code Pipeline, and Code Deploy was what we have before. We now have a managed service for building and compiling source code and for running unit tests. This is quite interesting because it's charged by the minute. So you have access to a pool of build machines that you can use, and you'll just be charged by the minute of consumption. And obviously you can fit that inside the framework that I described, committing your code into Code Commit or using Git, building your code processing pipeline using AWS Code Pipeline, performing your build operations with Code Build, and then deploying that with AWS Code Deploy as well. So a full suite of tools for supporting application development lifecycle. Thirdly, a new service called AWS XRay. This allows developers to analyze and debug distributed applications, providing the capability for you to embed a specific SDK within your apps. Today we support .NET or C#, Java, and Node.js JavaScript. And once you've embedded the SDK within your application, excuse me, we collect metrics and provide visualization capabilities for your app. So if you have a complex multi-component application, maybe microservices or a small number of services that support your application that are a little bit larger, you can trace and observe the behavior of the application, also the interactions between those different components using this tool. It provides this graph-based visualization. It provides a latency-based visualization where you can look at a trace, essentially, of the different transactions that take place within your application, allowing you to visualize overall performance and what the constituent parts of your overall performance are. So where are your bottlenecks? Which services or components might be causing your application performance to be degraded? So new service, but we welcome feedback on this actually. So if you are using this or considering using it, once again, we'd love you to talk to us so we can understand more about your use case. And if you do require support for the runtimes outside of the 3 that I've talked about, we'd also like to hear about that as well so we can prioritize what we can work on next. We announced a service called Personal Health Dashboard. This is intended to provide customers with a per account view of the impact of operational events on applications and services that you might be running on AWS. Today we have the Service Health Dashboard, right, which is at the regional level. The challenge that a lot of customers face with that is we can be green at the regional level because maybe 1 or 2% of our infrastructure has been impacted within a region. It's minimal from our perspective. But if you're in the 1 or 2% of customers or consuming infrastructure in that 1 or 2% which has been impacted by an event, we can be green, but you can be having an incident, right? And I'm sure there are a few people in the room that are operating at scale that might have experienced situations like that. What we do with the Personal Health Dashboard is we drill down into our infrastructure. We match our infrastructure events to customers that are impacted by those specific events, and then we provide notifications in a dashboard. So if you've got an EC2 instance where the underlying hardware has failed, you will be notified about it through this dashboard. If you're using DynamoDB and the shards that your database is spread across happen to have been impacted by a performance event or a networking event, you will be notified about it through this dashboard because we map our infrastructure into your service usage and then provide visualizations for that. It's actually a very important tool for customers to help them see how AWS is performing for them. Make sense? Shield, this DDoS protection and mitigation for AWS customers. We provide a standard level of support for all customers with effect from Thursday morning last week. So every customer is going to take advantage of this now. And it really mitigates against common attacks, things like volumetric and state exhaustion attacks, where we can observe anomalous behavior on our network platform. We can automatically mitigate that. For customers that are running mission-critical applications or APIs on AWS where they need to maintain public availability of those services in the face of sophisticated or higher volume attacks, we provide something called Shield Advanced. This is a managed service where we provide a DDoS response team that will help you respond to DDoS attacks against your applications and services. It protects ELB, CloudFront, and Route 53 delivered services. We have 24/7 human beings providing response to help defeat attackers that might be attacking your infrastructure and applications with these kind of attacks. Okay, and it also includes our web application firewall at no additional cost. If you feel that you might be the kind of organization that can benefit from this, once again, you should talk to us about that. There is a specific pricing model that we use, and it is, I think, on a per customer basis. Yeah, so you need to talk to us about it so that we can price it for you. Innovations in S3. So red indicates data, by the way. We're talking about data here. Just before the event, we announced quite a few enhancements to S3. I mean, normally these would have been things that would be well above the bar for the keynote, okay? In this year, they got one slide, so it's quite interesting. Data events in CloudTrail. We've had S3 logging and then control plane event logging in CloudTrail for quite a while. What we're doing with this is enabling customers to consolidate all of the S3 logging in one location, which is within CloudTrail. So that's a simplification initiative. Per object tagging, so you can put tags on specific objects and do things like bill reporting on the basis of that tagging. Storage class analysis, CloudWatch metrics, and something called S3 inventory as well. So enhancements to S3. If you're a large user of S3, you probably find these quite interesting, so I would take a look at them. Quite a few customers have built solutions using things like DynamoDB to provide this functionality themselves. If you have done that, you might want to consider retiring that code, okay? Because we provide them now as part of the platform. Just trying to simplify things down for you a little bit. AWS Glue, this is an upcoming data catalog and ETL service, so to help you move data between your data stores in a coherent and reliable manner, working with any JDBC compatible data store as well as AWS native services, of course, allows you to catalog, transform, and then schedule and run ETL jobs to move data into the right location for you. And that really fills out some gaps that we had in the overall platform that we had for customers that wanted to create solutions for dealing with complex data flows on AWS. So I would encourage you to take a look at that if that's a use case that you service with us today. The other thing that we announced that was related to large-scale data processing was a brand new service called AWS Batch. And this, again, is a fully managed service that's intended to help customers deal with batch computing at super high scale. So you can dynamically provision and scale batch fleets. You can optimize your costs with EC2 Spot Fleet, and you can set up priority-based queues and also scheduling for large-scale batch computing tasks. If you're doing HPC in the cloud today, this might be something that you should take a look at, looking at you. Yeah. Okay, and then we went on to talk about containers. I'm running out of time now, I know. So we talked a bit about ECS and about problems that it solves for customers. But the main thing we did around ECS was pre-announce a new task placement engine that allows customers to exercise fine-grained control over placement policies. So how should containerized tasks be distributed across a cluster of hosts that are going to manage them? To date, we've had either round-robin or AZ-aware scheduling, where we've tried to balance tasks across availability zones, but nothing more granular than that. In the future, we'll have more sophistication here, such as the important ability to put all tasks of a certain type on a certain instance type. So maybe you've got some containers that need GPU capacity. Well, it'd be kind of helpful to put them on instances that have that, right? But still have those instances available to run other tasks while they're not being used for that. So you can use things like the instance type placement rhythms to tackle that kind of challenge. The other thing that we announced here was a collection of open source projects for container management and orchestration called Blocks, okay? This is brand new, it's on GitHub. I haven't had time to look at it yet, but I certainly intend to over the Christmas break. Starting with two things, a cluster state service and a daemon scheduler to enable you to integrate third-party schedulers with ECS as a kind of abstraction layer that sits above ECS and lets you use other task placement engines to do job placement. If you're interested in more on that, just go here. I also have some fetching block stickers down here and outside as well, so we can offer stickers for that service. I think that is pretty much everything. Oh, there was a couple of other things as well. So we announced this. This got a cheer, actually, surprisingly, from the audience, which was C# support in Lambda. So you can write your Lambda functions in C#. And this got an even bigger cheer, which was the ability to deploy Lambda functions in CloudFront locations. So if you don't know about CloudFront, we have roughly 64 locations around the world where we do operations of a content delivery network with caching capability. And what we announced here is the ability to deploy Lambda functions to allow you to execute compute jobs at the edge of that network as well. Rather than having those only in 14 AWS regions around the world, you'll be able to do that anywhere worldwide through the AWS Lambda console by specifying Lambda edge targets within the console. At the moment, we operate only on headers, HTTP request headers, but in the future, of course, we may consider extending that to more of the payload as well. I think there's one more thing, which was this, a service called AWS Step Functions, allowing customers to implement a number of different workflow topologies for applications that are implemented using Lambda as microservices. So a visual editor that allows you to lay out the different functions that comprise your overall application or process flow, and then have logic within that flow to execute different functions or spawn multiple functions from single parents. So you can support a variety of different functional topologies for the applications that you run as well. This is in preview right now, so if you are interested in this, I'd recommend taking a look at the service forum and also making a request for access to the preview. So there, that's it. This is an impossible task, you see. I have 30 minutes. I had to cover all that and give away some stuff. So it's a very difficult speaking gig. I hope I did okay.
Time for one question, or half a question, actually. Anybody?
When's there going to be a Lex application on the Amazon store?
When's there going to be a
Lex application.
Well, we wouldn't publish Lex. Okay, so what Lex does is it enables other application builders to integrate voice UIs into their apps. So we're already using it for Echo. You know, it's what's already inside the Amazon Echo. But it's for other application builders that might want to build voice into their app. I mean, say you're, building OpenTable. Tell me about restaurants in Kensington for 9:30 tonight. You could build that kind of functionality into a mobile app very, very simply using Lex. That's what it's a platform for creating, actually.
Well, thank you very much for that, Ian. Much
problem.
appreciated. Give him a round of applause.